Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn. Before we get started, I wanted to inform you about a feature in the presentation that'll make the session more interactive. Please take note of the question mark icon in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation screen. By clicking that icon, it'll open up the question and answer feature, which will allow you to send questions to be delivered to the presenter at the appropriate time. Without further ado, we're excited to welcome Abhay Agarwal, a solutions architect at Improving, who's going to be sharing with us Lingua Franca, an Agile methodology for the AI age. Abhay, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. And thanks everyone for joining, those of you that can attend, or if you're watching this video on LinkedIn, I'm glad to be speaking with you as well. So I wanted to share with you Lingua Franca, which is my attempt at building a more AI-focused Agile methodology, and it's been built and battle-tested over the last several years by me and my team at Polytopal. Let me just start with a quick introduction of myself and what Polytopal is. So I am the founder of Polytopal. It's an AI design firm. I'm also a lecturer at the Stanford Design School, as a member of the Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute. I really started my career as an AI researcher working at Microsoft Research, but I ended up switching my career to design, receiving an MS in design from Stanford, and my original bachelor's was in electrical engineering and computer science from Berkeley. So Polytopal is a kind of a new AI-based solutions firm where we build human-centered AI. So we really take a design-oriented approach to building solutions and strategies for global companies and brands such as Spotify, JP Morgan, Nestle, and our approach includes a mixture of qualitative and quantitative research, algorithm, machine learning, engineering, development, but also strategy, design, etc. So I've really thought very deeply about how to bridge all these fields together and make it meaningful. And I've also experienced a lot of the challenges that come from organizations deeply embedded with messy technology, sort of complex delivery cycles, legacy infrastructure, hardware, software, etc., but also trying to build and innovate using AI technology. And just a quick background on my work with the Stanford Design School, I created and taught a course called Designing Machine Learning. It was in the design school. It was a collaboration between myself, Anand Rajaraman, who's a VC, and also was the inventor of Amazon Mechanical Turk. Ended up selling a company to Amazon and another one to Walmart. Really amazing luminary. And then the third instructor was Michelle Carney, who is now at Google's People in AI Research group. So we really combine sort of this interdisciplinary perspective on how to design and build with AI. So what does that entail? How do you combine different perspectives and viewpoints and skill sets? How do you strategize? How do you prototype? So those are the kind of considerations that we looked at in that course, and that eventually evolved into what I'm talking to you about today, which is Lingua Franca. So I first want to start with sort of the broader perspective around AI. I think the biggest question that it's worth asking right now is whether AI is overrated. So we've heard a lot about artificial intelligence. We've seen a lot of these kind of news stories. We've been told about the progress of technology, etc. And I think it's worth asking whether we all still believe that that promise is real, right? So I think a lot of you and myself should be coming into this discussion with a lot of healthy skepticism about the state of AI technology. And of course, some of you might have experienced the messiness of organizations when it comes to building AI, the low quality of data that's often pervasive and that persists in various ways across these businesses, etc. And I'm not going to really define AI specifically here. And I don't really want to dive into the minutia of that debate, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, if you're looking for a sort of a high level perspective, just kind of think of it as advanced analytics, or even as the sort of digitization of high skilled tasks. So things that go beyond, sort of things that can be trivially programmed, but things that are non-trivial to implement and to digitize. But I think my perspective on this, whether AI is overrated, obviously starts with some of these key metrics that we've started to see over the last couple of years. This graph that I'm showing you here is the progress in image detection recognition error rates. So if you present an AI algorithm with an image and you ask that algorithm to label that image to describe what that is an image of, this is the progressively lowering error rate in that. So as you can see, in 2010, you had almost 1 in 4 chance of being wrong. And this graph ends at 2017, but you can imagine that even more meaningful progress has been made in the last 3 to 4 years. And it's now come significantly below sort of an individual human error rate. So it's quite astonishing if you look at this individual benchmark of ImageNet. And just a quick additional graph, this is the graph of what's called the GLUE, General Language Understanding Evaluations benchmark. It's actually a set of several diverse measures of language understanding. So there's one section where you're presenting the algorithm with a passage of text and then you answer a question. You have these kind of logic games and puzzles. You have pronoun attribution. You have truthfulness, whether a statement is a derivative statement or is an entailment of another statement. So it's a diversity of benchmarks, really something that might be considered the sort of SAT of language understanding. And this graph is sort of confusing to interpret, but the 1.0 is the human average human baseline for each of these individual tasks that are comprised in GLUE. And then you have on the sort of y-axis, the x-axis, you have a list of these different algorithms. And as you can see, the average of those algorithms is increasing and is now sort of on average above human level of understanding, with several metrics, several tests within GLUE becoming way more accurate than humans. So I think the question that we should really be asking ourselves is, like, given all this promise of AI systems, we're talking about image recognition, we're talking about language generation and interpretation with algorithms that are clearly outperforming an average human in that task. And I think if you look at those, I think the natural answer counterintuitively should actually be that yes, AI is in fact quite overrated. Given that we've seen all this progress in these algorithms, the biggest question is, why have we not seen the same kind of mirror of progress and advancement in society at large? So, where are these pervasive autonomous vehicles? Where are my humanoid robots? Where are all the autonomous factories and predictive maintenance, et cetera, et cetera? So where are all these technologies in actual hands of users that were promised by these sort of fundamental, crucial research innovations? There's an open question of, like, why is AI not reaching that? Now, obviously, in this talk, I'm going to present the perspective that it's the methodology of collaboration and creation and creativity that's actually hindering that transition between the technology itself and real value for people. But I think the additional question to ask to whether AI is overrated is whether AI is also, in some sense, underrated, given that we have in front of us a lot of pervasive technologies that we use every day. One of the great examples is now Google Photos, which combines really a great many different algorithms and systems for browsing, tagging, searching images, for looking for faces, for categorizing them, for enhancing the image itself, color and contrast, etc. So a whole family of different algorithms are now being used, very pervasively on mobile devices by, let's say, close to 1 billion people. So clearly there's some promise that exists with a lot of this technology, but perhaps the sort of perspective that you might want to take is that there's a certain distance between that kind of core research innovation and the putting it into people's hands. And so, that's the question that I hope to develop a solution to, and then I hope to describe that in this talk today. So naturally, I think, again, the skepticism should lie in, do we really need yet another agile methodology to complement this change in technology? Is that what I'm advocating, that every new technology needs its own special snowflake agile methodology? That what is actually different? Why can't we use the same battle-hardened techniques that we've developed over the last years and decades, from Toyota's manufacturing plants to startup offices around the Bay Area? Why aren't those the right fit for this kind of new technology? So I hope to win you over on that, but I think there's kind of a crucial set of differences that exist when we're talking about AI in particular that really requires us to take a fresh look at how people collaborate and work together. And I think the easiest way for me to convince you of that is to give you an example. So I have a hypothetical example that I like to provide in these kind of talks. So this is the example of the quote unquote smart dating app. It's a hypothetical app that you can imagine. You bring together a multidisciplinary team that includes designers, data scientists, business analysts, and they set out to revolutionize dating with a new data-driven product that can help you find the perfect match, right? So that's the problem statement, and you put together this group of people. So, at the onset of such a project, you obviously have design as a key feature. You want people to use this product. Then you also have data science, where you want it to be accurate. You want people to actually receive good recommendations, and you want it to potentially be learning, to get more accurate over time, to be personalized, and to be responsive to sort of people's preferences, etc. And then you also have business. So you have business challenges, you have a business model, so maybe there's an advertising element to it, maybe there's a subscription model element to it, and that of course is its own set of concerns that warrants its own kind of separate zone of innovation in terms of these products. With non-stationary problems, you're talking about the design is evolving, the data is changing, the thesis of what data you want to use is changing, the business model is changing, you have to, all these things start to intersect. But let's say at the onset of this project, you're not thinking about any of those things, you're really just talking about how to start this work on day one. So what happens? Well, at this point, you can kind of imagine that these three different sectors actually have their own bubbles in which they operate under, their own sort of perspective, which they are approaching problems from. So in design, you would say that we start with users. So we want to start with ethnography. We want to capture deep needs. We want to understand what are people using today, where are their satisfactions, what are they unsatisfied with, etc. So you really start with that kind of meaty, thick ethnography, qualitative, quantitative work. With data science, you start with data. So you understand what data do we have access to? What does that data say? How error prone is it? How messy is it? How much cleaning will we have to do? How much bias is there in that data? What kinds of individuals does it cater to, et cetera? And you have to capture all that context. So, the data scientist will move in that direction, which is not diametrically opposed to users, but is certainly orthogonal in many ways. And then, of course, with business, especially with the rise of lean methodologies, you often start with, let's sell something. Let's make some sales, let's make some money, let's validate the business model before we do any of that user stuff, any of that data stuff. We're not going to spend all this money, internally exploring this solution space when we really need to find out where the profit motive is going to be. And this might have changed, with a lot of startup mentalities, with, how people build startups versus how they build, bootstrap businesses. But with startups, you do the same thing. You start with the pitch deck. You start with what sells to the VC. So you're still in a lean and agile way with your own kind of methodology, building to that, to that goal. And of course, what happens now is that each of these three camps has to now decamp to their particular thought leadership and methodologies. With design, you have design thinking, you have lo-fi prototyping. With data science, you have this kind of scientific process of putting forth a hypothesis, developing statistical tests against it. And with business, you have this kind of lean process that people often gear towards, which is, sell it, conduct these kind of like early sales, and then build it and then scale it, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens in this environment when you have all these three different separate camps? Well, here's a kind of hypothetical, quote that I just came up with of what happened, quote unquote, after the fact. So you ask the team what happened, how did this go? Well, we started by talking to users, then we pitched them a hastily conceived product. Then we tried to collect data to build it. Meanwhile, the users ended up liking something else, but we'd already started building the first thing. Then it turned out to be impossible to build. Then we tried to sell them something that was a simpler version, but it was also the simpler version of the bad idea. But then the users tried it, they didn't like it, it wasn't what they asked for. And at that point, it's just a mess. We gave up, right? And hopefully some of you are nodding your heads right now. This often happens in these kind of messy organizations. And I think with the rise of AI, with the rise of these more specialized kind of processes, especially in the realm of data science, I think this is becoming more and more common, really. And then if you asked for some kind of postmortem, the designers might say something like, well, the rest of the team wasn't listening to the users, so we were morally opposed to what they're doing, and we really wanted to focus on the users. The data scientists, if you ask them, they said, well, what the rest of the team wanted wasn't even possible technologically, so we did what we could. And then if you ask the business folks, they'll say, well, the users were willing to buy what we wanted, but nobody on the team wanted to build it for the reasons that they stated. So everyone comes out unhappy. They've all built to what they thought were these great design and lean methodologies, and it turned out not to work. And I see this day in and day out, over and over at organizations around the globe. So just kind of popping in one step deeper and kind of trying to figure out what actually was it that happened? What did they do, to make this happen? Well, you have to kind of take a look at what each of these three camps kind of imagined the solution to even be before you can really start to understand why they could not come to this kind of shared reality of how to move forward. So here's like what the designers probably came up with. They have this great, beautiful mobile application, responsive, color schemes, lots of great visuals. They, in this case, this hypothetical version, they have like these, different meters that are really responsive to user needs, what they keep hearing from people, things that, are really meaningful to human beings. But if you kind of take a second look at it, or if you have any experience with data science, you'll say that, wow, this is just completely infeasible. Like they had their head in the clouds. They had no idea what, AI means, what it's capable of. They totally, missed the goal on it. So then you ask the data scientists, what did you kind of expect that you were going to make? Well, the data scientists obviously are in love with the data. They're in love with what the results can provide. So, what they might have come up with is this cool expert dashboard, which has tons of embedded intelligence features in it. You've got, top matches, you've ranked them, you've given them a score, you've created this radar chart with different compatibility indexes. You're talking about demographics and state by state. You have all this like rich, data, but you've completely missed the mark on the product because nobody's going to use a dating app that looks like this, right? So clearly they missed the mark as well. And then if you ask the business people, they'll show you this amazing business model that they validated with customers, they've segmented the market, they've figured out the marketing messaging, and they've created this typical McKinsey style three-tiered approach with the pricing. It's all they've done the pricing and margin analysis on it, but turns out that this is just not going to create a valuable product in the long term. I mean, it's there's no consideration to how they're going to build it and what it's going to look like and whether there's any need for it in reality. And so they focused so much on creating this kind of business perspective and selling that they really didn't stop to understand where's the heart and the soul of the product. So obviously this is a hypothetical example, but I do think it's worth trying to tie it back to a lot of what we see in enterprises all the time, because I think that this example is just embodies so many of the different kind of dysfunctionalities that I see in organizations that we work with. In my mind, the real problem is not the lack of methodologies, right? It's not that they didn't have a Scrum style, Kanban style thing at hand to get to work. It was that each one of these different disciplines that are sorely needed in creating a solution has their own epistemology, their own view of what reality is and what it means. They each have their own partial understanding and partial slice of the world. And most importantly, they each speak a different language of value, a different language of development, of cycles, of what needs to be done. And so each of those groups thinks that they have the solution in the palm of their hands, if only everyone else were to join their ship and to figure it out. So it's a complex challenge, and I think AI specifically in this equation is the real problem, right? If once you're working on an AI product, you end up emerging with scores of new challenges, scores of new ways of doing things that just didn't exist in the past. I think AI on its own is actually really naturally unfit for even the present kind of agile methodologies that we often use. So Scrum, Lean, Kanban, design thinking, you name it. There are key challenges for teams in building AI-enabled, AI-based systems in that fashion. And believe me, I've actually worked with teams that were super agile. I mean, sprint planning meetings every 2 weeks, daily stand-ups every morning. Everyone kind of uses the, Kanban style, the boards. They're moving the sticky notes across the wall. And inevitably, what ends up happening is that the AI folks, the people that are working on the AI algorithms or the AI technology, end up siloed outside of the agile process. And so the product manager on the team, knows it, but can't really explain why, that they're not as engaged in the Scrum planning meetings. They're not able to describe their work in that Scrum style, Kanban style fashion. It just really doesn't work. The ticketing doesn't really work. It doesn't feel right. Everything feels like it would fall apart because there's all this extra complexity. So let's kind of break down what are those complexities that people actually experience with AI that make it not super agile. Well, crucially, there are fundamental uncertainties and constraints when building with AI technology. You are limited by the capabilities of intelligence. You're limited by the capabilities of the data, the ability to receive certain kinds of data, the cost of that data. They're fundamental constraints and uncertainties, and those need to be taken into account. It's not the same way as building an API or building a web service where everyone kind of knows the stakes of the game. You really end up hitting against brick walls. At some point in an AI project, you will hit a brick wall and you need to move around it. It's not the same as building a mobile application. Secondly, there are lots of these what are called second order consequences, which means that a design decision early on in your project can have vast consequences later on. And therefore, even if you use one of these kind of lean methodologies, you have to be willing to and capable of thinking along the lines of how do you prepare for those kind of second order consequences, and how do you think about revising your methodology in the face of what can be really destabilizing observations and outcomes. It's also incredibly hard to prototype, it's hard to test, and it's hard to scale AI. So lo-fi prototyping becomes much more challenging. Selling to customers becomes much more challenging. There's a lot more doubt and uncertainty in the face of the customer when they say, "Can you do it? Can you show us a demo?" And then you get to that process all over again where you don't know how to get started. There's unpredictability in the user experience when you don't know how this data and how these systems are going to end up feeling, right? You have a recommendation algorithm for movies or products, and the data you collect, biases it in a certain way, or, when you buy a refrigerator, all you see on your feed later on are more refrigerator. Like, there's unpredictable user experience quirks, and those have to be accounted for. And it's hard to do that when you have these kind of really sort of daily activity, individual contributor focused kind of lean methodologies. And then finally, I think what is really has been the biggest challenge for using some of these methodologies is that there's a lot of within team information and power asymmetry. So if somebody on the team, a data scientist knows what gradient boosted decision trees are, and no one else on the team knows what gradient boosted decision trees are, that person, the data scientist, is going to have a lot of power over the group to pressure them to work in a certain way, because they have these sort of keys to the kingdom of the fundamental core of what it is that they're going to need in order to build a product. And then everyone else has to kind of scramble around that person or that group of people in order to work with them. So it's challenging. There's many reasons why, but the AI really isn't a natural immediate fit for some of these agile methodologies. So we've developed Lingua Franca, which is its own methodology, and I want to kind of start by going into the background. All these methodologies, they all have some meaning behind their name and why they've been chosen like that. Kanban, is based on the Toyota techniques, etc. So each of them has their own mythology, and Lingua Franca has its own mythology as well. Lingua Franca is, of course, a term that exists in popular parlance that just refers to like a vocabulary for a certain industry, or like there's the lingua franca of construction, which is all the terminology that you use in the construction industry, et cetera, and so forth. But lingua franca actually was an actual language, if you want to call it that. So between the years around 800 or 900 AD and the years 1900, there was a language spoken in the Mediterranean that was sort of a hodgepodge of all of the languages that existed around there. So the Mediterranean itself, obviously the cradle of modern governments, origin of capital and coinage, the center of the ancient world, has been inhabited jointly by dozens of different cultures, many different languages. And what ends up happening is that if you're trying to trade across these cultures, it's impossible for a trader to know all the languages. So instead, they created sort of a shared hybrid language with some of the same words for the same things. What is a loan? What is a ton? Shared measurements. So they really did actually end up creating that shared language that allowed them to work together. And that is exactly how I fashion Lingua Franca as an agile methodology. There's this fun, kind of famous anecdote about the traders in France when they spoke lingua franca. The locals in France would think they're speaking Arabic, but then if you go to Turkey, then the locals in Turkey would think you're speaking French, because it's just that hodgepodge, and everyone can kind of feel like it's a little bit like something else, but they still feel like it has a little bit of their own in it. And really that's what I hope to create in both kind of a collaborative environment, but also as an agile methodology for people to work together. So there's three key tenets to the Lingua Franca methodology that make it separate and its own from other agile methodologies. So the first is that it strives to build a common language. So there is a document that we've published called Lingua Franca that provides teams with that shared terminology, a set of principles, a set of words, best practices, a handbook for building that team structure and executing projects, and words that you should use to describe different pieces of an AI project. So it's all there, and that common language really helps to reinforce that this is something that everyone can reason about and talk about, without having to assume this kind of information asymmetry. Secondly, it's Bayesian thinking. Really, that's one of the cruxes to the system, where Bayesian thinking is sort of this hybrid between this lean mentality as well as the scientific process, where you embrace that kind of best guess hypothesis testing based approach, where you do what you think is the best guess at the time, and you update your thinking with new information, and then you go back and you see how that changes the hypothesis, and you move on. And then lastly, it embraces the idea of working groups. So it allows for diverse methods to exist within the broader group that is working on a project, but really embraces that kind of small, 2-3 person working groups to solve problems, validate hypotheses, and also maintain a strong cadence as a larger team. So that's kind of the tenets. I'm going to go through each of those pieces and kind of explain them in more detail now. So we published Lingua Franca, again, as I mentioned, a document that embodies all these thoughts around how do you build a common language for AI. So it's we call it a design language. We go through a set of FAQ questions. What is AI? What is human-centered design, et cetera, et cetera. We built a handbook that allows you to get started as a team. How do we start building this stuff? Where do we start? How do we select a problem? How do we use human observation and design research in order to come up with these hypotheses? How do we start to put data together and develop insights from that? How do we make trade-offs in the design, et cetera? So there's pieces of that handbook that allow team members to all feel like they're working on the same thing finally, right? How do you combine data science concerns? How should a designer think about data science? How should a data scientist think about design? When do you have to come up with ethics, and how do you think about accountability? And all those different concerns, and really just level setting across an organization. We've also created a set of 8 principles. So each of these principles is like a thick manual for a fundamental tension or concern within AI. So there's sections such as architecture. What does it take to architect an AI system? How do you develop the underlying technology for that? Then there's thinking about things like the dynamics of the system. How do you deal with second-order consequences and non-stationary systems? There's questions around transparency. How do you make the users aware of what the system is doing? What are the common paradigms of transparency? What are some best practices? What are some examples? All those exist within the principles guide within Lingua Franca. And then finally, we have a set of 20 different elements. So elements are pieces of an AI system. They are sections or reusable components, modular components. So you have things like an assortment. An assortment is really a word that refers to, that list of recommendations or the list of suggestions or a list of similar items. And by using the term assortment, what we've tried to do is reframe you away from some of the common terms that might exist within one segment. So a business person might say, oh, like we need a recommendation system. And then the data scientist will be like, wait, what are we recommending? I thought it was just a list of similarity. And it's like, okay, well, now we've gotten into this position of where neither of us knows what we're talking about. Instead, you use the term assortment and you understand what that means and what it's referring to, but in both a technical way and a user experience way. And now suddenly is able to collaborate in that meaningful way. What is a guardrail? How do you interpret a guardrail? Is that something that exists as code? Is that just in a document somewhere? What does that actually mean? What is a warm up? How do you onboard these users? So all these require meaningful definitions and meaningful work in order to break them down and finally give your entire team a shared understanding. And the hope is that they're actually going to start using this terminology. They're going to start using these words. They're going to, start constructing deliverables around these things. They're going to start bringing them into the brainstorming process. I think it creates real meaningful change when everyone on a team has a set of shared words that they're using from day to day. So that's the first pillar of Lingua Franca, and you can actually look at all that content. It's all there for free on that link that's shown in the mock-up there, linguafranca.polytopal.ai. So feel free to go and check that out. The second pillar is this notion of Bayesian thinking. So Bayesian thinking is really key to the Lingua Franca methodology. It's this wonderful, wonderful hybrid of the scientific process and kind of a lean methodology. It's sort of an evolution of scientific processes that allows them to be brought into, boardrooms and workshops around the world. It's something that even the staunchest, PhD level researcher and the move fast and break things style entrepreneur can agree on. It's literally the one thing that about their reality that they can finally come and say, yes, okay, let's be Bayesian about this. And I think the moment you start to use that terminology, the moment you start to adopt this framework, your team will start to cohere because they'll start to see the connectivity between them, what they share in terms of how they're thinking about evolving, the problem, the hypotheses over time. So it's both the philosophy of open-mindedness and also kind of a statistical tool that has different mathematical underpinnings to it. But the key is this kind of cycle that you create a hypothesis, you conduct a test that brings in new information, and that information updates your belief, right? And that belief allows you to construct a new hypothesis that allows you to do more testing and then update that belief again. So everything is about this kind of always tentative, always a best guess belief system, but you evolve and continue to progress as a team in that Bayesian way in order to to create progress. So the Bayesian methodology is all about crafting good hypotheses. So in order to use this Bayesian methodology, you have to craft a good hypothesis, and then you have to test that hypothesis. You have to use that new data to craft a better hypothesis. That's really the key skill, I think, to using Lingua Franca as a team. So what is a good hypothesis? So good hypothesis is opinionated. It's not just a generic problem, such as finding out why the users churn. It's opinionated, saying, we believe that users churn because X. And so the task is to validate that. So first you might say, okay, talk to them. Is that why they churn? And maybe the next thing is, okay, develop a prototype of a thing to see if that is why they churn and if you can get them to stop churning that way, right? So you craft an opinionated hypothesis that leads the team to know what the action should be to test it. The hypothesis should also answer a question. So it shouldn't just be a task, such as build the UI. It should answer a question. It should say a infinite scroll based UI will help users stay within the app longer, right? So it's more complex. It also involves some more internal steps, but it actually answers a question, and you can come out of that with a real key, new variable that you can bring to the team. So you would obviously, test. Should we build some prototypes around infinite scroll? Should we, do a low effort, way of validating that? Okay, if that worked, then maybe we need to start to add that feature, and then we need to start measuring it, and then we need to start giving those results and seeing where that leads us, right? So you answer a question, and that question allows you to gain information, craft the new hypothesis. Finally, it's not a scientific hypothesis, and this is one of the problems that I see all the time within the AI space when they're using lean methodologies, is they assume that when you're answering a question that you're actually looking for some kind of publishable result. But in reality, in a Bayesian world, you don't need necessarily statistical significance. You don't need a p-value. You don't need to conduct that regression test. You don't need to hit the level of reproducibility necessarily that you would hit in order to publish a paper about it. You just need enough information to be dangerous. You need to know what the next hypothesis should be, because the next hypothesis is not going to be completely separate. It's going to be an evolution of the current hypothesis. So it's key that you don't see this as a formal scientific process, but as an approximation that allows folks to work together. And then finally, the third pillar of Lingua Franca is this embrace of working groups. A working group is really the unit of Lingua Franca. It's a group of 2 to 3 people that, pre-pandemic days would be sharing a large desk together, would be using the same whiteboard, would be having their own planning meetings. And the key is that you're working to create both equity and transparency in that group. So if you're talking about conducting a prototype and validating with users, you want to make sure that there's multiple eyes on that. You want to see if who's going to be involved on that. And people can be in multiple working groups at the same time. But the hope is that you're always allowing multiple people to be aware of that information. So there's never that information asymmetry where information is centered in a single person or a single task. There's always multiple outs. There's always multiple stakeholders to any task at hand. And of course, in post-pandemic days, this can be as simple as a shared Slack channel. It can be as simple as a shared document. But again, you're enforcing transparency and equity and making sure that there's no information asymmetry within the group or within the working group that are within the larger team. Okay, so now that I've explained to you the sort of key overview of this methodology, let's try to take it to an actual example, use it in context. So here's what a problem statement should look like when you're using this methodology. You have the big problem statement at the top. User needs X to do Y. So you have a strong problem statement that implies a solution, and then you want to validate that. And again, validating that solution can either mean winning the business, winning the customer. It can mean pleasing your stakeholder. Again, it's just a mandate for the team. And that problem statement can evolve. So you put a problem statement there, and you'll see that a problem statement is literally just a hypothesis. So this problem statement, in order to solve it, you have sub-hypotheses. You have some problems that need to be answered in order to address the larger question. So maybe the larger question is, millennials need a subscription-based app to buy stylish clothes and matching sets. Okay, well then you have to ask a couple of sub-hypothesis questions. One, is it possible to build a high-quality data science model from this public shopping data set that we have access to? So that's one big hypothesis that needs to be answered. Second, in parallel, well, we think an infinite scroll-based app UI will be engaging and understandable. That's another thing that needs to be validated. And then lastly, there's another hypothesis that our prediction algorithm will create sufficiently creative recommendation. And again, those are all slightly different but potentially interrelated hypotheses. They all need to be validated. And maybe the same data scientist that works on hypothesis 1 is working on hypothesis 3. But the point is that you're asking these specific questions. And then as you might kind of notice, that it's all kind of fractal like from there. So each of these sub-hypotheses can have sub-hypotheses within them. And so you can even think of an entire company, an entire organization using this kind of methodology, starting from the mandate of the CEO and then boiling down to the individual roles of everybody at the company, built within these kind of recursive hierarchical hypotheses. So it's key that there's some open-ended nature to these hypotheses, and that they involve sort of a good deal of work, and that the team kind of is aware. So you typically also want to maintain some kind of shared source of truth, a document where you show all the old hypotheses, what are the results of those hypotheses, and the new hypotheses. And after you receive a new hypothesis from the team, you go out and you validate it, you collect information, you bring that information back to the team, and the team as a group comes up with what is the new hypothesis that needs to be tested from that old one. So in this worldview of hypothesis testing, Bayesian thinking, there's not really this backlog as much as there is in other methodologies where you just maintain this massive backlog of bugs, of issues, of epics, etc. Because the team has to be open-minded about what can change and what has yet to be solved. So instead of using this backlog, you use notes, documentation, and brainstorming sessions to establish those future hypotheses, but you leave a lot of that work undone until it comes time to building it. So that's kind of the key view of what this Lingua Franca methodology would be like. So let's apply it to a specific customer engagement. This is a customer of Polytopal, and I'll show you what that methodology looks like in practice. So this company is called YUR. They're a consumer product company that provide fitness monitoring solutions for VR gamers. So it's a in-game tracker, a virtual heart rate monitor and calorie counter, connects to a fitness band, etc. And the question that they came to us was, can we build an AI-based fitness monitoring solution that interprets and estimates your heart rate, your calories, etc. So it's a big challenge. There's lots of pieces to it. So we start with this original problem statement. It's our best guess. We don't know whether any of these pieces are really true, but we want to start somewhere. So we say, okay, well, the original problem statement is millennials want a highly accurate heart rate estimator that is turned on while playing VR fitness games. Okay, so what happens when you have that statement? Well, in order to validate that, you have to have a couple of sub-hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is that VR fitness early adopters are actually closely tracking their metrics and vitals, because otherwise, why would they want a highly accurate heart rate estimator? The second hypothesis is that an AI-based heart rate estimator can be built from the sensor readings that exist on a VR headset. So those are two big questions that need to be answered. So we set about answering those two questions. In the first one, we did user interviews. And what we found was that users actually didn't care that much about high accuracy. They care more about consistency and fun while fearing body image issues. So we collected all that deep information, and it turned out that we actually had to update our problem statement based on that information. So our new problem statement, millennials want a fairly accurate yet fun heart rate estimator while playing VR fitness games. So one of the hypotheses is an AI-based heart rate estimator can be built from sensor readings on the headset. And then the second hypothesis is that users will provide us with rich data for training a machine learning model. So again, we're testing hypotheses around all the different pieces of building the system based on how Lingua Franca sets about setting forth an AI methodology. So then you update it again, the hypothesis around, okay, what's the specific algorithm that we're going to be using here, about user adoption, what's the visualization of this information. So again, you go through multiple iterations over and over and over, and eventually we found this final problem statement is that millennials want a virtual fitness band that lets them check their heart rate in game. So we did user testing, we understood what their needs are, how they're using games, and we found that a virtual kind of 3D fitness watch that while you're inside of the virtual reality headset, when you raise your wrist, it shows the watch there with like your readings, all again a virtual wristband that is not connected to any heart rate monitor, but is simply using your estimation of your vitals based on your movement in the VR world. That is the solution that they want. And so after validating that in multiple ways, we were able to build it feasibility-wise. And again, we integrated all those concerns together. And what you get is a solution that looks kind of like this. So you're playing this, a music game, you're checking your fitness watch, you start to play, and then so this game basically allows you to sort of punch and use your hands and sort of play along to the beat. So you have these kind of blue and pink punching gloves, and then you have those balls. And so the cool part is that what we found is that as they have the fitness band, they're actually able to look at that while they're in the game, really. And that was kind of one of the big realizations that we found, is that they want something that's fun and immersive, and doesn't necessarily have to be this kind of data science dashboard with all sorts of numbers, etc. So that was a key innovation, and that came from that kind of Bayesian thinking. So I'm going to move from that. And so in my last minute or so of the talk before moving into the QA, just wanted to kind of reiterate what is it that Lingua Franca is and why I think it's so powerful for organizations. So it's an agile methodology specifically geared for artificial intelligence. There's 3 key pillars to it: a shared language, which you can find at linguafranca.polytopal.ai. We've created our best, sort of our best guess at what that shared language could be. It's Bayesian thinking, where you use repeated best guess hypothesis testing in order to advance your problem statement and come up with a solution. And then it's the embrace of these small working groups that allow you to divide out tasks without keeping information siloed within individual people. So that's the methodology, and with that I will stop, and hopefully if there's any questions from the community, then I can take those, or I'm happy to go back to any section and spend some more time with it there.
Awesome, Abhay, really appreciate it. Yeah, we do have a few questions. One of them is, how are you showing business stakeholders that this methodology is more valuable or as valuable than using something like Kanban or Scrum or Lean in the AI development?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a great question. So there's a couple different answers to it. I can give sort of the pessimistic answer and the optimistic answer. I think most business stakeholders are sort of looking for something that has been tested and sort of validated with a suite of products, a suite of companies, etc. And so, the success of Kanban was in part because it was adopted and designed by Toyota, and lean startup methodologies, where those books were sitting on bookshelves in startups around the world. So I hope that Lingua Franca can attain a similar level of recognition as folks start to search for ways of solving these problems that they experience. And if they're not experiencing those problems, then there's clearly no reason to switch. But if they are, then here's a great alternative that you should look into. So that's a pessimistic answer, right? You just have to take time for it to organically grow in reputation. Now, the optimistic answer is that Lingua Franca allows you to share your progress as part of your sort of methodology itself. It's like progressive documentation. every hypothesis that you've tested, you've collected data. So all that data can be presented to your stakeholders. You can show visualizations, you can graph it, and at any point you have the voice of the user, the voice of the stakeholder, the voice of the customer playing a part. And you also have a view of the ground truth of what hypotheses are left to be answered. And there's going to be uncertainty there. But I think that the key thing, I think that maybe your question might be referring to, is that in Lingua Franca, it might not be the case that you want to show how the sausage is made to those business stakeholders, because it does require an open-mindedness to new information, and some business stakeholders might not be as excited about that as the people building the technology. So if you go to a business stakeholder and say, yeah, we're still figuring it out, we might not know at all what our customers want, this product might fail, blah, 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 then people might get upset. But there are ways to convey that information to business stakeholders in meaningful ways using the progressive documentation that you build as a team in process.
Awesome, thank you. So one of the questions that came in, which is actually kind of outside of really this talk, but maybe you can give some insight to it, is have you seen AI assist Agile teams in building their products faster or better?
So yeah, I mean that is my experience, and I've worked with a variety of teams, with different headquarters around the world. I've worked with Silicon Valley-based teams, and those Silicon Valley-based teams that are, in the cases that I'm talking about, working on kind of deep AI technology, they do embrace agile methodologies because they're learning, they're failing fast, etc. But the problem that I see over and over with these teams that are working on AI technology, but also trying to use those kind of 2-week sprints or epics or kanbans, is that the AI parts of the team, the folks that are AI experts, slowly silo away from the agile process because their worldview is so different from that bug fixes, what are you doing today, what product are you pushing today, that kind of a worldview. And so in order to actually bridge those things, we have to create a methodology that works for both of those kinds of people. So AI teams are using Agile. They're naturally agile. And of course, large companies that build with AI are also embracing agile methodologies. But as many of you might already know, they're hesitant. They're hesitant to embrace agile methodologies because we're talking about business critical data that might have security issues, where they're not sure what the second order repercussions are of using that data. So it becomes challenging very quickly. And I've actually seen sort of a reverse movement away from agile towards traditional waterfall style. You guys do this, once you're done, we'll do this style of development, because it's that challenging to integrate this kind of complex technology. Thank you.
So this is the last question, which really is, you may be able to shed some additional light, but is there any additional training or guidance on how to implement this framework or your framework, which I did post the link to your website where they can get obviously all the documentation that you guys have released, but is there any more added info or guidance that somebody can get to?
Yeah, so I mean, I would love to build this into a more formalized training process where we actually allow people to, immersively go down this kind of framework and apply it to problems, the typical way that you have training for Agile or Scrum, that improving is so renowned for. I think Lingua Franca, I see it as continuous incremental advancement of those kind of methodologies in order to respond to the new realities of artificial intelligence and machine learning technology. So while I have not yet put together a course specifically geared around Lingua Franca, I can point you to a couple of other resources that I think are really useful. Obviously, the first one being linguafranca.polytopal.ai, which is a comprehensive resource that gives you that shared language, that gives you a handbook. So it's really for personal reading, but it also allows you to bring some of those questions to your team because every principle has its own list of examples, considerations, best practices, There's design questions that are provided within each principle. We're hoping to release additional information in addition. For example, within each element, we want to provide getting started scripts and visuals and mock-ups for how those will look and feel within a product. So linguafranca.polytopal.ai is your ground truth, ground zero, so to speak, for this methodology. In addition, there is the material for the course that I taught at Stanford. So the link to that is designwith.ml, and I'll be happy to post that into the chat as well. But all the syllabus and course material for that course at the D School is there. All the slides, all the scripts and other kind of executable code that you can use, and we cover everything from prototyping, to user experience, to what are the different available technologies, how do you evaluate them, how do you build as a team, what are sort of ethics and accountability considerations and fairness and bias considerations. So those are all there. And I think the last thing I would like to do, and maybe this is something that improving as a community can start to take part in or start to advise in, is how do we turn this into something that can be trained at scale to the broader marketplace? How can we embody some of these processes and really make them available to a generation of agile AI, based teams, or teams that are just dipping their toes in AI? I think that's a really great question. I think there's a lot of momentum in the broader community and the marketplace around having this kind of training. But I think, the real question is, the nitty-gritty details. What does it look like? What's the certification? Who are we targeting, et cetera? And I personally think, given Improving's position in the market, that this actually is a really beneficial potential new direction that allows you to start winning over more customers that are doing more data science, data engineering, artificial intelligence work, while at the same time, being able to stand behind that agile methodology, being able to transform organizations, innovate within large, complicated teams. So I think this is the best of all worlds, and I'm happy to sort of be the flag bearer, the banner cheerleader for this.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for attending Improving's virtual lunch and learn today. And Abhay, thank you for sharing. Just as a reminder, the recording of the session will be available on our virtual events page at improving.com/virtual-events on Monday. Other than that, have a great weekend. And again, Abhay, thanks.
Thank you.